In February 1943, a man sat in a basement office in the heart of Stalingrad. His name was Friedrich Paulus, and he was about to become the most famous German military officer of the Second World War. However, he would become the most famous officer for a catastrophic defeat rather than victory. Just days earlier, Soviet soldiers had found him in the Central Department Store's basement, where he had set up his final command post. When they captured him, they captured something more important than just a general. They captured the turning point of World War II. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, we need to go back. We need to understand how Hitler dreamed of conquering the Caucasus, how almost 250,000 soldiers marched across Russian steppes, how confident victory was within reach, and how in the ruins of one city, one of the world's most powerful military machines was broken forever. This is the story of the Battle of Stalingrad, probably the bloodiest battle in the history of mankind. When Hitler looked at a map of the Soviet Union in spring 1942, he saw opportunity. His armies had conquered much of Eastern Europe and pushed deep into Soviet territory, but they had failed to reach Moscow, and the winter had been brutal. Soldiers frozen on the steppes, supply lines stretched to breaking point, thousands upon thousands dead. Still, Hitler refused to accept that his ambitions were impossible. Instead of attacking Moscow again, his armies would turn south. They would push into the Caucasus Mountains and capture the oil fields there, the lifeblood of the Soviet war effort. With Soviet oil in German hands, Hitler believed, the war would be won. He called this plan Operation Blue. Many generals thought it was madness. The plan was strategically risky, exposing a dangerously long flank to the north. But none dared openly oppose the Führer. Fear had replaced reason. Hitler divided his Army Group South into two. Army Group A would advance into the Caucasus toward the oil fields. Army Group B would reach the Volga River, cut off Soviet oil supplies, and capture a city that bore a name Hitler both obsessed over and insisted he didn't care about: Stalingrad. "I'm not attacking Stalingrad because it bears the name of Stalin," Hitler insisted repeatedly, so insistently that it seemed he was blatantly lying. The more he denied it, the more obvious it became. Capturing the city bearing Stalin's name was not necessarily military. It was more psychological. It was a way of telling Europe that Germany was invincible, that it would never be defeated. The mission fell to the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht, considered Germany's best soldiers. They had taken Paris, walked through Warsaw and Kiev. Hitler used to say that with his 6th Army, you could storm the heavens. The man chosen to lead them was Friedrich Paulus, one of the finest general staff officers in Nazi Germany. He could plan operations beautifully and clearly, but he was missing something crucial: the determination to make decisive decisions when everything hung in the balance. When the moment came to act on his own initiative, he hesitated. On July 17, 1942, almost 500,000 Germans and their allies began moving from eastern Ukraine towards Stalingrad. The invasion force included Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian divisions, allies who barely understood why they were fighting this war. The initial advance was stunning. German tanks and mechanized infantry covered vast distances in days. One German officer wrote that columns of tanks and armored vehicles stretched across the steppe as far as the eye could see. The heat was intense, water was scarce, but the Germans kept moving. On July 23rd, they captured Rostov-on-Don. In a bend of the Don River, they surrounded 8 Soviet divisions. Of 13,000 trapped Soviet soldiers, only 105 escaped. For the first time, the German military command had outplayed the Soviets. Stalin had been convinced the main offensive would come toward Moscow. When the Germans suddenly turned south, the Soviet Union had almost nothing in place to stop them. By the end of July, the Red Army was pushed back beyond the Don, only 60 kilometers from Stalingrad. But on July 28th, Stalin signed an order that changed everything. He made retreat without orders punishable by death. Barrier detachments of 200 to 300 men stationed behind Soviet lines would shoot anyone who tried to retreat. Those who escaped capture-faced penal companies assigned impossible tasks. It was brutal and desperate, but it worked. Soviet soldiers, knowing retreat meant death regardless, fought with ferocity the Germans had not anticipated. The Soviets had made their choice. They would hold Stalingrad, or they would die trying. On August 22, 1942, the Germans crossed the Don River and drove towards Stalingrad. In the evening, advanced German tanks reached the Volga River. The next day, August 23rd, the Luftwaffe came. 1,200 bombers took to the sky. They came in waves, raining firebombs on the city below. Fires erupted everywhere. Telephone cables were cut, water pipes destroyed. Oil storage facilities caught fire. Columns of flame rose almost 600 meters into the sky. Smoke was visible 350 kilometers away. It was the most massive bombing of any city on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a city of 400,000 people. 100,000 had already been evacuated to the left bank of the Volga. When the bombing ended, over 91,000 civilians and soldiers were dead. The city was transformed into a graveyard. Stalin was categorical. Stalingrad would not be surrendered. The Red Army would hold or be destroyed. To defend the city, he threw the hastily reformed 62nd Army under 42-year-old General Vasily Chuikov into the burning ruins. Chuikov had only 20,000 soldiers and 60 tanks. His headquarters staff told him there would be no reserves. "Hold on," they said. Chuikov held on. On September 13, 1942, the battle for Stalingrad truly began. German bombers screamed across the sky. The whistle of falling bombs was deafening. One German soldier wrote that it was hard to believe anything living could survive such an assault. The German infantry went forward through clouds of smoke and dust, but Stalingrad was different from other cities. It was built in a narrow strip along the Volga, stretching 30 kilometers, but only a few kilometers deep. Every street was a choke point. Every building was a fortress. In the north, the Germans targeted Mamayev Kurgan. In the south, they drove toward the grain elevator. 10,000 soldiers of the 13th Guards Rifle Division crossed the Volga. As soon as they jumped ashore, they entered battle. German positions were only 100 meters away. In the first day, every 3rd Guardsman was killed. The railway station changed hands 15 times over 5 days. The grain elevator defenders repelled 10 assaults in a single day. The Germans called this fighting Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. It terrified them. They understood tank warfare and mobile operations, but fighting in basements and sewers, ambushed from above, attacked from behind, artillery was nearly useless. Shells hitting ruins killed friend and enemy alike. Tanks could not maneuver in narrow streets. Air support often couldn't distinguish between German and Soviet positions. The Soviets adapted brilliantly. They used rubble piles and destroyed buildings as defensive positions far stronger than any fortifications. Soviet soldiers cut down German attacks with disciplined fire. At night, sappers mined passages between buildings. Assault groups of 6 to 8 men launched surprise attacks in darkness with nothing but knives and sharpened spades, killing Germans almost silently. Then there were the snipers. The most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a native of the Ural village of Oleninka. Before the battle ended, Zaitsev personally killed 225 German soldiers and officers. German terror of the snipers became so intense they staged deceptions. Scarecrows dressed in military uniforms, white flags hung to entice snipers. Nothing worked. Every day, German soldiers died. Every day, the Red Army held. Among all the stories of heroic resistance, one stands out. At the end of September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov's platoon recaptured an ordinary apartment building. For 58 days, his men held this single building against repeated German assaults. General Chuikov later claimed that Pavlov's men killed more German soldiers than the entire German army had lost during the conquest of Paris. The building became a symbol of Soviet refusal to yield. While Germans battered themselves against Stalingrad's ruins, something was being prepared far behind Soviet lines. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had identified a weakness. Paulus's Sixth Army was not alone. Romanian and Hungarian divisions held the flanks. These troops were less well-trained, less equipped, less motivated than the German Sixth Army. Zhukov and Vasilevsky proposed a daring plan, Operation Uranus. They would concentrate over 1 million Soviet soldiers on 3 fronts. They would attack not the German Sixth Army directly, but the Romanian armies on either side. They would break through, encircle the entire German grouping, and trap Paulus and his army. The preparation was conducted in absolute secrecy. Soviet soldiers moved only at night. 17 false bridges were built across the Don to confuse German reconnaissance. On November 19, 1942, at 7:20 in the morning, 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire on Romanian positions. The bombardment was unprecedented. When the barrage ended, Soviet tanks swept forward. Romanian defenses collapsed like tissue paper. Romanian officers, caught off guard, fled in panic. 3 days later, on November 22nd, Soviet spearheads met near the village of Sovetsky. The ring closed. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded between the Don and Volga, with no way out. For the first time, the German command faced a reality they had not anticipated. They could be defeated, they could be trapped, they could be destroyed. Hitler was categorical. Paulus must not break out. The Sixth Army must hold its position. A relief force under Field Marshal Manstein would break through and rescue them. Paulus understood the truth. There was no way out. A breakthrough was impossible. But he had been ordered to hold, and he was a man who followed orders. Hitler refused breakout suggestions. In his mind, retreat was surrender. A German field marshal would not retreat. He would hold or die. Paulus held. The relief operation, Winter Storm, launched December 23rd. For a moment it seemed like it might work. German tanks dashed 200 kilometers toward the trapped Sixth Army. But Soviets destroyed half of all aircraft supplying them. The relief force ground to a halt. There would be no rescue. Then came the winter. The Don steppes are among the harshest places on Earth. Temperatures dropped to -30 Celsius. Snow covered everything. Soldiers with no fuel, no heat, no warm clothing huddled in frozen dugouts. Hunger set in. Lice infested everything. Dysentery killed the weak. Men went mad. Some begged doctors for poison to end suffering quickly. Paulus could see it all, watching his army slowly die. In early January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Ring, the final phase designed to crush what remained. For 45 minutes, 7,000 artillery pieces and mortars rained fire on German positions. A Soviet officer wrote that day, "After such a bombardment, there is little choice. Either lose your mind or die." On January 30th, Hitler made a final gesture. He promoted Paulus to field marshal. In Prussian and German history, no field marshal had ever been captured. By promoting Paulus at this moment, Hitler was sending a message: kill yourself rather than surrender. Paulus understood perfectly. When Soviet soldiers found him the next morning, he raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not going to shoot myself for this, Corporal," he said, referring to Hitler. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The dream of Case Blue was dead. Germany would never recover. News of Paulus's capture reached Berlin like a shockwave. Germany had lost armies before, but this was different. This was the first time a large German army had been trapped and destroyed. This was the first time German soldiers had surrendered en masse. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein wrote, Stalingrad is a turning point in the history of the Second World War. The wave of the German offensive broke on the Volga and then rolled back like a wave of surf. From this moment, initiative passed to the Soviet Union. German diplomat Ulrich von Hassel wrote in his diary that Stalingrad had affected all of Germany. He wrote, "It was the Germans' first defeat. Everyone realized that the war was over." In occupied territories across Europe, oppressed peoples saw that Germany could be beaten. Secret negotiations began. Could they make separate peace with the Western Allies? Could they escape this doomed alliance? In America and Britain, the reaction was swift. President Franklin Roosevelt sent a certificate of honor to Stalingrad, but the most powerful symbol came from Britain. King George VI sent a ceremonial sword, inscribed in both English and Russian, to honor the heroic defenders. The inscription read, "To the citizens of Stalingrad, hard as steel." The total casualties were staggering. The Red Army lost more than 1 million men, nearly 500,000 killed. Over 91,000 civilians were killed in bombing and fighting. Paulus spent the war in Soviet captivity. In 1944, he signed an appeal calling for Hitler's removal and the overthrow of the Nazi regime. After the war, he was released in 1953 and settled in East Germany, where he spent his remaining years teaching military history, always signing letters as Field Marshal of the former German Army. When news of Stalingrad reached Hitler, he stopped listening to classical music. He had a breakdown. The man who had dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich would die in a bunker 2 years later, having presided over the destruction of everything he had built. The Battle of Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility and changed the course of World War II forever.